I'm Suzanne Nossel, and I'm the Executive Director of PEN America. I'm delighted to be here. Just briefly, I wanted to mention to everyone that PEN America, which is the writers' organization for the defense of free expression, put out a report on Monday of this week called "And Campus for All." And you can see the cover here. It's available on our website at pen.org/on-campus. And what we've done in this report is really try to take a comprehensive look at all of the issues that are under discussion today and tomorrow here at Bard, from microaggressions to campus speakers to safe spaces, trigger warnings, and the free expression implications of Title IX. And we do so looking particularly at 3 case studies: UCLA, Yale, and Northwestern. And our objective in the report really is to sort of give both sides of these arguments, all sides, their due. And then towards the end, we put forward what we call the PEN Principles on Campus Speech, a set of specific principles and guidelines to help not just university administrators, but also faculty, students, commentators make more sense of these debates and actually find some common ground, because we believe these debates need not be so polarizing. That what we see a lot of the time is the sides talking past one another, and that we need to come together around a common agenda that will advance diversity and inclusion on campus, but also encompass robust, uncompromising protections for free speech. So please take a look, and I look forward to being part of the discussion. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce a very exciting dialogue here with Greg Lukianoff, who's the president and CEO of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is the leading organization advocating for free expression on campuses from a libertarian perspective. And Greg has been out there at the forefront of many of these controversies as a very prominent voice, co-authored the Atlantic cover story, The Coddling of the American Mind, last year. And I don't think we could have somebody who is more central to how these debates are playing out. And in dialogue with him will be Angus Johnston, who is a leading expert on student activism, teaches at Hostos Community College as part of the city, which is part of the City University of New York, and is on Twitter as Student Activism, and is a very prominent voice coming from a different perspective. So I think we're in for potentially some fiery conversation up here on stage, but we're also going to be quick to engage the audience. So look forward to your participation. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Thank you so much for having me. I do always like to correct that. We're a civil libertarian organization. We're not actually, we're an interesting coalition internally of people who are both liberal, conservative, and libertarian as an organization. But where's the clicker? Oh, great, okay. So I'm really honored to be here. I'm really excited to talk to all of you. And I just wanted to say I'm only here tonight, and I have to leave tomorrow morning. There's a lot of things going on, but definitely partially influencing that is, oh no. Is it not working? Oh geez. It caught up. So I got a lot. It is actually mostly work I got to get home to, but he just took his first couple steps the other day, and I'm just very excited to get back to see my son. So I wanted to I wanted to cover this in a couple different angles, and I wanted to first start with is it down? There we go. No. Okay, that's just off. Oh my God. Maybe I'll just do it from the computer. Okay. So what the slide you would be seeing is how did I destroy it? Just the right. Okay, got it. Okay, so this is a favorite quote. This is also quoted in the excellent PEN report, which we're writing about today at FIRE. Sweezy v. New Hampshire. And I do love the dramatic flourish. The Supreme Court tends to take academic freedom very seriously. What academic freedom means in terms of the law is actually very murky, but basically, bottom line, freedom of speech, particularly at public universities under the First Amendment, is very strongly protected. At private universities, it's a little more complicated, but I can talk about that as well. But I do love teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate, to gain new maturity and understanding. Otherwise, our civilization will stagnate and die. I just think that that's a really powerful, powerful statement. And I think the Supreme Court meant it, even though it's a little melodramatic. So what I'm going to do today, it's very different from talks I usually give, but I'm giving this talk partially out of a little bit of frustration with the way people talk about issues on campus. I'd get tired of reading people telling me what I've written in different articles, that it basically someone responding to an article, then summarizing an article, which is the opposite of what I actually said. And I'm going to go with, kind of like Alexander Brodsky did, I'm going to go with some of the common sort of, what I refer to sort of simple arguments about what's going on campus. And I'm trying to make the point overall that it's generally more complex than that. So simple theory one, is this just political correctness run amok? The term, I don't particularly love the term political correctness. I feel like I'm forced to use it because we don't have vocabulary for it yet. But here's my thing that I've been on lately, and particularly due to cases like this. And we have a lot of cases like this, but none probably quite as horrifying as this. Is anyone familiar with what recently happened at University of Northern Michigan? This is a case where if you went to report that you were raped or that you were having a bad bout of depression or anxiety, and you went to the counseling services at University of Northern Michigan, and this happened to many students, you would receive a threatening-sounding letter saying, don't tell your friends you're considering self-harm. Don't tell your friends you're considering, and this even happened when people didn't mention anything about self-harm or suicide. This to me is an absolutely insane idea. If anybody knows anything about depression, knows anybody about people at suicidal stages, the idea of telling someone, first of all, isolate yourself, and second of all, you're a burden on your friends, is about the craziest thing you could actually imagine doing. So whose narrative exactly does this fit? Does this fit? Is this liberal? Is this conservative? How can the culture war make sense of it? Well, frankly, in the oversimplified narrative of the culture war, you kind of can't. But I do think there is an answer to where this comes from. But it's interesting. Oh, so yeah, this is one of the things, this is some of the writings from the University of the Dean. It's just, it just is so heartless. But so how do you also explain this? University of Hawaii at Hilo, they told students that they couldn't hand out copies of the Constitution or protest the NSA outside of this little tiny free speech swamp on campus that they had to ask 2 weeks in advance permission in order to use, and they were told, you can't protest the NSA outside of the free speech zone in advance permission. It's not the 60s anymore. But okay, maybe the Constitution, maybe that fits sort of a culture war narrative, but hold on, wait. California State Polytechnic University, this is a guy who's protesting cruelty to animals. And he's not only told that he has to go to a tiny little free speech zone, that he has to ask the state for advance permission. These are both state schools, First Amendment applies, this is not constitutional. And that not only does he have to do all these things, he has to wear a badge that explains he's been granted permission by the university in order to engage in his free speech activities. So what narrative does this fit? This actually fits this other simple theory. Now, I of course have to swallow some pride in referring to this as a simple theory because this is a theory that I offer primarily as the main reason for a lot of the crazy things we see on campus in my book Unlearning Liberty, my first book in 2012. But I think even that is oversimple. But I do think there is a lot of truth in the idea that as we've seen an expansion of the administrative class at universities, that you end up in a situation where universities are over-regulating. They're regulating aspects of students' lives that were once considered to be off limits. But that narrative doesn't even entirely explain everything. So do people know about the Laura Kipnis case? This is a case of a feminist professor. She writes for the Chronicle of Higher Education. She's a second-wave feminist, self-described. And she wrote about how, in her opinion, Title IX is actually certain dramatic interpretations of Title IX are infantilizing to women. They actually think she thinks they're disempowering. She mentioned a lawsuit at her school She thought that was that. She was happy it was a little bit of a controversial article. And then next thing you know, she was being investigated for under Title IX for writing an article criticizing the overreach of Title IX. Yeah. She was not allowed to know who her accusers were at first. She didn't know what the actual charges was, what they stem from. And what actually ended up resolving this case is she took it public, once again through the Chronicle of Higher Education, to explain this is amazing. This actually is worthy of the term Kafkaesque. I'm not allowed to know who I'm being charged by. But once she took it public, shockingly, not shockingly, Northwestern suddenly dropped the case within something like 24 hours of her taking it public. And this is part of the twist. This is part of one of the things where it's not just administrators. It's not that administrators are imagining phantoms. And I do try to explain time and time again, a lot of the wackier cases you see on campus come from situations in which it's not everyone's wildly politically correct, it's that they actually are being incentivized to overreact. And that's partially because, as Janet Halley mentioned in the previous presentation, the Department of Education has come up with a definition of harassment that is just way too broad and way too pliable. If I could get this actual blueprint definition of harassment in court, it will be, and I guarantee you, it will be laughed out of court because it is so inconsistent with existing First Amendment law. When we actually have a case at Louisiana State University where a female professor was fired citing the blueprint. So we'll get to see what happens in court. I'm willing to take bets. So we talked about this in a recent article by my executive director, Robert Shibley, in a book called Twisting Title IX. So administrators, a combination of the feds, but the more recent phenomena, of simple theory, is it students run amok. Now, I want to be clear here. I have been distressed over the past couple of years by the fact that I think students are in some cases asking for, as another short book that I wrote was called, freedom from speech instead of freedom of speech. It has been a shift in my career, because overwhelmingly for most of my career, the single best constituency on campus for freedom of speech has always been students, particularly poor and minority students, particularly non-traditional age students, people who felt like they didn't fit in. They understood free speech better, certainly than administrators. In many situations, I think better than professors. And something did start to change a couple of years ago. But how does that explain some of these things that really make it into the news? So some of the ones that really are sort of sexy situations. Well, like UCLA and the whole UC system has a definition of microaggressions. Microaggressions being small, usually unconscious slights that you might commit that are either racist or sexist or marginalize people. I always like to point out, I'm fascinated by the topic of microaggressions. I think we should absolutely be studying it. But as soon as you actually put in the power of administrators the idea of what to define what they are, they very quickly look like the opinions of administrators of things you shouldn't say. And this includes things like America's a melting pot, I believe the most qualified person should get the job, America's a land of opportunity, and probably the most controversial one, saying that affirmative action is racist. Well, if you go to law school like I did, you're going to have to read opinions in which the entire argument is people making the argument that affirmative action is racist. And so we also have ridiculous circumstances like University of New Hampshire, where they listed these words as sort of quasi-microaggressions. Now, of course, Fox News fixated on, well, guess which one Fox News fixated on? It's a toughie. They were mad about the word American. They thought that was totally offensive. Now, I grew up with a lot of friends from South America. I'm familiar very much with the argument that everyone from the Americas is an American. So this didn't really surprise me. Is it a microaggression? I don't know. But the one that I actually thought was the most horrifying was Arab. Because I also used to work I have a lot of Lebanese friends. I used to work in a Lebanese restaurant, and they proudly self-identify as Arab. And they're being told by the University of New Hampshire that they can't call themselves that anymore. They were explaining the preferred term is Southwestern Asian, and I'm like, have you consulted anyone who's actually Arab about this? And I always have to bring this up. It reminds me of an episode of The Office called Diversity Day, when Michael Scott asks one of his beloved employees, Oscar, how do you self-identify? And he says, well, I'm Mexican. And Michael's clueless response is, of course, is there a less offensive way to refer to you? which is obviously the most offensive thing you could possibly say. But so then you end up with even situations like this, where all of these are coming together. All of these forces are coming together. Some oversensitivity, some maybe the legitimate argument, but also when something turns into a meme, you lose complete control over it. People are just giggling about it. But people saying that Harambe memes at universities might violate Title IX. That's a little bit of a weird argument, but it shows the combination. Now, but let's take one really big example, probably one that if you've heard of any recent case involving sort of like student oversensitivity, it might involve this one. What got dubbed the chalkening at Emory, where someone chalked the words Trump 2016, and you had reactions from students that were saying that they felt genuinely traumatized by this. And so, I swear. And in some cases, actually, I read some of these things really being like, oh my God, they really actually feel like they're under assault when they see this. I was only concerned, though, because the university president said they were going to find out who chalked Trump 2016, because they have closed-circuit camera. That lasted about a day. Until the university president said, oh, wait, we're allowed to chalk at the university. If you're allowed to chalk Hillary 2016, you should be allowed to chalk the other guy. And so this was kind of, not a lot happened here. It was just an interesting, but that one got so much more attention than other cases. So this brings me to kind of why is this happening? Why is, and I always have to sort of qualify this study. I don't love this study, but this is a study that talks about whether or not you think it's safe to hold unpopular opinions on campus. And even back in 2010, when I think things were actually comparatively safer to dissent on a college campus, students were already saying that they didn't necessarily think it was safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus. And when they asked this, only 40% of incoming freshmen said that they strongly agree that it's safe to hold unpopular points of view. And by the time they left, only 30% of seniors thought that. So it goes down the more exposure you have to the academy. And guess who the most pessimistic group in this section was? Faculty. Only 16.7% of faculty members felt safe that it was safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus. Strongly agreed with the statement. And my opinion is, if you don't strongly agree with that statement, you don't think it's safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus. I think this graph would be even worse. If you did this survey today, I think it would be a lot worse. And there are concerns about student attitudes about free speech. I think that this one's particularly poorly thought out by students. Yes, I understand the concerns that students have about hurtful or hateful speech or wanting to go after offensive speech. I don't agree with it. I'm an old-fashioned First Amendment person. But I was actually more surprised by the fact that 43% of them believe that you should be able to, that you should disinvite controversial speakers. And I think that that's really poorly thought out on the part of students, because I think students need to understand that some of their favorite people in society are people who would be considered controversial speakers to the people actually in power at the university. That's why I think it's sort of poorly thought out. And there is a disconnect between millennials and the rest of America when it comes to attitudes about do you support censoring offensive statements about minorities, for example? But this repeats in all sorts of studies, that even though everybody in America is trained to say, I believe in freedom of speech, when you actually look a little deeper into millennial attitudes, there's a lot more sensitivity, a lot more of an idea that speech codes are good and that you can have positive censorship. That does concern me. But I also am concerned about this issue. Universities maintain, this is the percentage that we currently have, speech codes. They've maintained speech codes since the late 80s. And what do I mean by a red light speech code? These are red, yellow, and green, just really simply. Red means laughably unconstitutional. The classic example of a red light speech code was a ban at 2 different colleges over the years, banned inappropriately directed laughter. Yeah, seriously. At University of Connecticut, Drexel, and be careful, by the way, but both ban these things. So speech codes are definitely part of it. But I do think that, well, like I said before, the increase in campus bureaucracy has a lot to do with it. And I think we're kind of returning back to sort of the administrative argument. And there's been a massive increase in the number of the growth of the administrative class at universities, and we're paying through the nose for it. I mean, for the top 100 schools in the country, most expensive that is, it's between $70,000 and $55,000 a year. You tell that to a regular working class person, that sounds insane. Actually, hell, you tell that to anybody, it sounds insane about the amount that and increasingly that money is going to administrative costs. So what is my grand theory of censorship on campus? I do believe that ideology and groupthink play a role. I would think it would be irresponsible not to mention that. However, I do think over-bureaucratization of universities do. But the unsung reasons why you end up having a lot of these crazier situations happen is this interrelationship with America's litigiousness. I say that as a lawyer. We sue each other way too much. But also the Department of Education being way too foggy. And the Department of Education has the power to remove all funding from universities that don't comply with their mandates. That is a death sentence for a lot of universities. So this is ultimately my thinking on how you end up in these situations. And I wanted to point it out just to make sure that we avoid any caricature of what we think is actually going on. And this is my contact information. I would love to hear from you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with Angus.
Thanks, Greg. That was really, really interesting, fascinating stuff. I also want to say thanks to our moderator. I've only read about the first half of the new Penn report because I've had a very, very busy week, but it's great stuff so far. I'm really, really excited about it. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. I think it's a very, very important intervention. And I want to be very, very quick so that we can get a chance to have a conversation, and there's several things that I'm not going to talk about that Greg mentioned that I hope we have questions about so that we can duke it out a little bit. But I want to just say two things before we get to the question and answer. And I want to start by saying that we give the American university way too little credit, I think, for the complexity of the job that it is doing in terms of hosting all of these conversations and hosting all of these incredibly divisive debates, and doing it for the most part, I think, really, really well. I see a lot of folks who are undergraduates and some high school students here, and a lot of folks who are my age or older. And one of the things that I would encourage those of us who are no longer students to contemplate is how often we had really deep, really serious, really intense conversations about really divisive political, social, philosophical issues when we were on campus as students. And compare that to how often we have those conversations today in our regular daily lives. And I think most of us would say that we had those conversations a lot more when we were students. And also, I think that it's important to say, as somebody who spends a lot of time with today's students, that today's students are, in my experience, really good at having really hard conversations. And part of the way that they have gotten good at having these really hard conversations is by talking about stuff like microaggressions, is by talking about stuff like trigger warnings, by talking about stuff like the ways in which we can offend each other. Because people who are hanging out with people who are very much like them don't need to set rules and guidelines for their conversations. Because those conversations are easy. There's a reason why in the world of international relations, the rules for diplomacy are so detailed and so arcane, right? There's a reason why when the president of one country meets the queen of another country, there's an incredibly long list of rules of how they're going to interact with each other. And the reason is that each one of them is bringing their own set of rules into the interaction, and those two sets of rules don't meet up with each other. So if you want to have a smooth and positive and productive interaction with somebody who is very much unlike you, the way to do that is to be clear about the ways in which you may step on each other's toes. And so as much as some of us may think it's a little silly to say, it's a microaggression to say that in America anybody can achieve whatever they want or whatever these things are, I think it's really useful to know that if you go into a conversation with somebody and you say that, you might get under their skin, particularly if you have no idea that you're likely to get under their skin. with that kind of a comment. Because knowing how to avoid giving unintended offense is one of the most crucial ways to keep a conversation going in a positive way. I realized that I did not set a timer for myself, so I'm not sure how much time I have left, so I'll just say one more thing and then we'll move on. In the spirit of uncomfortable conversation, I'm going to close by disagreeing with something that Professor Berkowitz said earlier. He said that claims of trauma shut down debate. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that claims of trauma shut down debate. I don't think that accusations of racism shut down debate. I don't think that disinvitation campaigns shut down debate. I'm actually, in certain circumstances, a big fan as a free speech advocate for disinvitation campaigns. I don't think that microaggression guidelines shut down debate. What they do is they reframe debate. And they reframe debate in a way that is sometimes really productive and really helpful and really useful. And then sometimes they reframe debate in ways that stifle productive conversation. But what we need to recognize that they do, what we need to recognize that the effect of them is to reframe debate to make it more congenial to some of the people who are participating in the debate. And one of the things that I think is really useful to note along those lines is that when free speech is invoked as a principle in a situation where the First Amendment is not directly implicated, that is also an attempt, in many cases, to reframe debate and to pull the debate into a framing that is more comfortable for some of the members of the conversation and less comfortable for some of the others. So I think one of the things that we really need to recognize, and I'll close with this, is that part of having robust discussion and debate on a campus or anywhere is having robust disagreements about what the limits of that debate are, and robust disagreements about how best the project of free speech can be advanced. Because Greg and I are both profound First Amendment fans. We are First Amendment fanboys, the two of us. But we disagree in some fairly serious ways about what the First Amendment calls us to do. And that means that the First Amendment isn't the sole province of any one side in any of these debates. It means that the First Amendment is itself a place of contestation. And I think that the more that we can have these conversations, and I think, again, that Penn really advanced that project, the healthier and more robust these conversations are going to be. Thank you.
Thanks very much to both of you. I'm going to kick it off with one question for Greg, and then Angus, you're welcome to comment as well, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor, so please get your hands ready. So, Greg, here's a question for you. In doing the Penn report, one of our points of departure was a concern that a rising generation of young people in this country is becoming, or maybe becoming, alienated from free expression as a principle and an ideal. And that is because, in their words, and many students, including in the New York Times story that released our report on Monday, there's a student at the end who's quoted as saying, the campus is a psychologically unsafe place for many of us, and that's because of, or partly because of free speech. So it's a sense that they have that free speech is not for them. It's protecting somebody else's speech, and it's allowing speech that makes them feel, whether you call it uncomfortable, they may call it unsafe. Not physically unsafe, probably, but psychologically unsafe, as she put it. And my question for you is whether you worry at all that some of the framings of this controversy, for example, there are many ridiculous examples that we can put up, and we talk about a lot of them in our report, and they can be lampooned and caricatured, and we can all laugh. But there's also, and this came up on the panel this morning, some really serious underlying concerns about, verbal conduct that can, point in the direction of sexual assault or be on a continuum with sexual assault, about language that does cause genuine and documented psychological harm. And do you worry at all that, in your vigorous and very, I think, powerful and potent campaigning that you may at times be at the risk of contributing to this dynamic where students feel like their perspectives, their experiences are dismissed and that kind of free speech is not for them?
Well, for me, I mean, we try so hard to, it's one of the reasons why I set this the discussion up like I did, is because as I said, I get tired sometimes about hearing the opinion of like a Fox News reporter being basically attributed to us, where we try to frame things carefully and thoughtfully and remind people of, and yeah, we're very strong, we're very pure on freedom of speech. But I do get concerned, and this is something that I do think that when people talk about, oh, we're going to lose a generation because we're not explaining because I think ultimately we're saying we're going to lose a generation, we're not explaining free speech well. Not because free speech is inherently bad, and that they find it, and because this is what I think, one of the reasons why we have had, it's just a theory, but one of the reasons why we have had, I think, sort of a little blip on the sort of students being much more responsive to free speech and seeing free speech as a bad thing, is partially because I think a lot of these students came up during the very strong anti-bullying campaigns. Now, when it comes to anti-bullying, I think it was about time. I think that absolutely there is no reason why we have to tolerate people being as cruel as we were to each other and to people who were different than us when we were kids. And certainly, my dad grew up as a refugee in Yugoslavia. It's a past time that we start addressing bullying. But I do think that we ended up with students who have only heard about freedom of speech as the argument of the bigot, the bully, and the robber baron. And I'm doing everything I can. I went to Comic-Con this summer. I was speaking on a panel about law, but I'm trying to figure out ways to message this. And the thing that, if anybody's ever really heard me speak about this, the one premise I always come back to is epistemic humility. As obnoxious as what we, old school ACLU types might sound, it's ultimately because we don't know everything about the world. We don't know what everyone thinks. We're actually not all that clever left in isolation. We need discourse in order to become smarter. And I don't think that is inherently such an alienating conversation. And one of the things that I'm really sad to discover that students don't learn is how absolutely essential freedom of speech was in the civil rights movements for minorities, particularly including gay rights, and how incredibly important it was. And then also the simplest fact of all, that in a democracy, what protects majority opinions is money and the vote. You don't need a First Amendment if you don't care about minority rights. You only need a First Amendment if you care about minority rights. So freedom of speech, to the extent to which the First Amendment was passed, there's a reason why you didn't have a meaningful civil rights movement until the First Amendment started being strongly interpreted in the 1950s. That was not a coincidence. And I feel like right now, I'm mostly finding what I feel like is almost like an anti-free speech PR campaign. But that goes to the fact that people aren't learning good lessons about it.
Okay.
Could I just
Angus,
very quickly?
sure.
Yeah, because I think this question of why there is this skepticism about free speech is an important one, and my answer is a little bit different than Greg's. Let me just give you one example. A couple of years ago at Mount Holyoke, there was a theater group on campus that decided that they were not going to mount a production of the vagina monologues as they had done for 10 or 15 years in the past. And the reason they decided not to do it was that they considered the vagina monologues to be not trans-inclusive. They felt that it didn't really speak to their framing of feminism, their conception of feminism. The trans issue was an important part. There were a couple of other things as well, and so they decided not to put on this play. And they were attacked by multiple people as being enemies of free speech, which, if you think about it, is pretty damn bizarre, right? Because free speech doesn't obligate me to put on a play that I don't want to put on, right? Me deciding what play that I'm going to
make you do Cats.
Me deciding which play that I'm going to mount as a college theater troupe is the essence of free speech, and having the ability to make that decision. And so one of the things that I think is really unfortunate is that there aren't more free speech advocates not only defending those students, but coming out and saying, when other free speech folks say, you're an opponent of free speech, going, no, they're really not. You're completely misunderstanding the concept, because I think that's one of the reasons these students feel so embattled.
Yeah, we touch on that briefly in the report, and we do point out, though, that if it becomes an environment where you can no longer put on a play about a vagina because not every woman in the university has a vagina, that excludes another kind of viewpoint. So I think there might be a little more to it, but I'm going to turn to the audience. Yes, with the black blazer in the middle, please.
I'm interested to hear what both of you have to say.
Although our voices, we can't hear her.
I'm interested to hear what both of you have to say about the distinction between what is clearly the public space of the university and what is the kind of private-ish dorms, residence halls, dining halls. Because while free speech says that I can't stop you from saying something, it certainly doesn't obligate me to listen to what you have to say. And I wonder if some of what you disagree about comes from that distinction, right? Like, the things you bring up about dignitaries and the rules they use to interact with each other. Those are rules that are used when they're in public doing formal meetings. And I'm not a dignitary, but I can't imagine that's how they have backroom discussions.
Thank you.
And so I wonder if that brings up when discussions are beneficial and when rules restrict debate, right?
Thanks. That's a great question. Greg?
I think it's a very interesting. I think it's a great question. I thought that was more direct.
No, happy to. You can respond to me this time if you want. I think there's a few reasons why that's a really, really interesting issue, and one of them is that as a faculty member, the campus where I teach is my workplace, but as a student, the campus that you attend is often the place that you go to, you attend classes, and the place that you live, and the place that you socialize, and the place that you work, and the place, and so on and so on and so on. And many of these spaces on campus are either public or quasi-public. And so you are living your entire life in a space which other people regard as a public space. And I think one of the places where we've seen this come up in a really powerful way recently is in terms of students wanting to keep journalists out of some of their activist organizing meetings, where a lot of folks have said that that's a violation of freedom of the press. But the reality is that the Board of Trustees can always keep reporters out of their meetings. The reason why students often have a hard time or are given a hard time for keeping press out of their meetings is that their meetings are being conducted in public because they don't have access to the kind of private, limited spaces that other people in society often have. So I think that, and if you combine that with the fact that because of social media and the intense traditional media interest in what goes on social media, I think a lot of times students, activists and not, really feel like they're living their entire life under a microscope right now. And the desire to push back and to preserve some zones of privacy, I think is in many respects a really healthy impulse.
Okay, that leads me to the topic of safe spaces. But one thing I did want to say about sort of the idea of sort of talking about really sensational examples, I do want to be really clear. It's not just that we're cherry-picking crazy examples at FIRE. Like, if you go to the FIRE website, when you deal with this, and I know that my view is skewed by the fact that I see this stuff every day, all the time. But when you start getting to beyond 50, when you start getting to a couple thousand examples of, wow, that was a really ridiculous case, you start going, okay, maybe there actually might be a problem. But when it comes to discussion of safe spaces, one thing, and that kind of goes back to my theme, I've been really frustrated at the way people have been having this discussion. Particularly the President Shapiro of Northwestern University called people who don't believe in microaggressions, I don't know anybody who doesn't believe that microaggressions exist, I didn't know that was a thing, and people who don't believe in safe spaces are imbeciles and idiots, like really, really mature for his speech to his class, to his school. And the frustrating thing about the discussion of safe spaces is that the definition of safe space that people are objecting to ferociously is this idea, that this entire campus is my safe space, and therefore, this speaker that I don't like shouldn't come here. That that might be something that me and Angus disagree on, but that definition I think fundamentally short circuits the idea of a university. If, however, you're talking about your affinity group, saying that I belong to the Black Student Lawyers Association, I belong to the LGBT group, that's great, and we totally support your freedom of expression to have that. But at the same time, when University of Chicago talked about safe spaces, people kept on leaving out the fact that they modified it by saying intellectual safe spaces. And that's appropriate, in my opinion, for a university to say, because they can't promise you, even within your LGBT group, that everyone's going to agree. But in discussing this, two other kinds of safe spaces have come to the fore that I find really interesting. One is the one that I grew up with understanding what a safe space was, which was a safe space to be emotionally honest. And that's what it meant when I was younger. It basically meant talk about difficult things, talk about your horrible experiences, talk about your messed up upbringing, talk about all these things that you've always been afraid to talk about. But someone added a point to it. Nobody trusts anybody anymore because you can immediately tweet that out. You can tweet it out of context. You can take someone's gut-wrenching story that they just sent to somebody and send it out. And they added the idea of maybe the safe spaces you need are those safe places, to be honest, where everybody agrees that nothing goes beyond these walls. And that's a very interesting idea to me.
I want to ask a follow-up question.
Back, yes, with the jacket, yes. The white shirt. Can I just speak up? Or? Sorry, no, it's a few rows in front. A few rows in front with dark hair. Sorry, I'll go to you next. But she had brightened when I designated her, so I didn't want to deprive her of that. Go ahead, please.
So I appreciate these conversations about freedom of speech, but one thing that I'm worried about is if we look at the panelists throughout this whole conference so far, every single member, at least from what I can tell, has been white. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really big problem because if we're going to be having conversations about freedom of speech and we're only looking at a particular kind of lens, then that's not really complete freedom of speech. And I guess I wanted to ask, when you are talking about freedom of speech, you're basically talking about freedom for people to say things that might offend people. And what I'm worried about is that the space that you've created for talking about freedom of speech isn't including the variety of perspectives outside of the sort of white sphere. And I wanted you all to address that.
Thanks. One of the things we do talk about a lot in the Penn report is the idea that by making campuses more diverse and more inclusive and more equal, that enables more voices to participate, and that is a positive for free speech. So that is something, as Penn, that we very much see and agree with.
And I want to say, I think it's a great point. And I actually my initial inclination was to say, absolutely great point, totally valid. I am a white guy. This is my opinion. But should it be more representative? Sure. But I do want to say one thing that I want to caution people about. I think, and this is the term I use for it, I think we as a society, I think we as human beings are incredibly good at coming up with excuses for why we don't have to listen to each other, why we don't have to listen to each other's opinion. And what I'm afraid we're doing on campuses these days is we're developing increasingly exquisite technologies to let us off the hook to not have to listen to people for whatever reason we come up with. For example, if someone's conservative. So conservative used to be the way you could say, I don't need to listen to this person, they're conservative. And it's but what about Thomas Sowell? What about great African-American scholars? It's well, no, but they're conservative, we don't have to listen to them. And then when you add in sort of well, no, but they're male, no, but they're this, no, but they're that, I think it ends up in a not such a great place ultimately at the end if we actually think we're completely off the hook of listening to people if we have some excuse for not listening to them. And I think our entire society is currently doing this. But yes, could or should the panel be more diverse? I agree, but I do want to caution people to remember that that we are already way too good at figuring out ways to not have to listen to each other.
Okay, towards the back there was a question. Thanks.
So I wrote down my question. So in response to your article, I was thinking that rather than our education system they're creating high tensions with people who have minority opinions, I think it's our political system that should be blamed. I feel like our political system is being reflected in our education system. Our political system has become extremely polarized, and people are ostracized for not choosing a side and even being blamed for it in some instances. For example, not choosing a side during the election. There's no longer an in-between option. You're either liberal or conservative, and if you do choose a side, you somehow embody all of that which that side represents. And because of this pressure, the thoughts of students and teachers are all converging towards very similar ideologies. In our classroom, our seminar classroom, we read the Communist Manifesto, and we talked about how, like, in our political system, if you like bring up class warfare, like, you're a communist, and that's like an insult. And for us, like, our political system has become so binary, and if we do, like, I go to a very liberal school, like, probably most of us do, but if, like, someone has conservative views, it's like, oh, you're a Republican, or you're a racist. And I feel like more so than our education system creating this environment, it's our own political system. Yeah, I'd like for your response to that.
Do you want to take that first?
Yeah, well, I think we're in a political moment right now that is incredibly difficult for a lot of people. I think you know, I don't think we've really quite recognized how much pain this current political moment is causing a lot of people, and that pain is likely to linger beyond November 8th. People are beginning to talk about that more around issues of sexual assault and sexual harassment that have come up. I think that we are beginning to talk about it around issues of race and racism. In terms of the chalking incident, on the one hand, I absolutely think that administrators should be allowing chalking in a very broad sense. But we are in a weird moment when a campaign slogan can also be reasonably and legitimately interpreted as racist hate speech. That's a very, very strange moment, right? And we have seen examples of pro-Trump graffiti which were intentionally, clearly intended as racist hate speech. So I absolutely agree with you, but I also think that at the moment, as our binary is in some ways fracturing, I think that that's going to be, in a lot of ways, even more raw and more difficult for a lot of people to manage.
Yeah, and my feeling is I think a lot about political polarization, and I actually I wrote a book called Unlearning Liberty, and a big chunk of it is all about political polarization and about how I mean, you know, you should always be skeptical of social science, but it's amazing how easily, if you take a dozen people and, you know, some lean some to the left, some to the right, you pull them individually first and then separate them, even for a couple of hours, just to go talk to each other about political issues, they come back much more radicalized than they were even a couple hours ago. This is one of the easiest experiments to recreate. And what I think, one of the reasons why we have seen tensions sort of flare up on campuses is that it is reflecting a larger polarization happening in our society, a scary polarization that's happening in our society. That first might have seemed kind of cute, you know, like when you were reading, there was a book, it's about how we increasingly live in counties that are more politically homogeneous. And the more recent studies show that we increasingly live on blocks that are more politically homogeneous. And that tends to promote polarization. One thing I would love to know, and the one thing I was skeptical about what you said, is I'm not totally sure, and I hope you're right, that students are getting better at talking across lines of differences and wanting to talk across lines of differences. I would also love to know how you would actually study that, because from what I've seen of studies, is people on both sides of the spectrum are not even really physically living all that close to people that they disagree with, let alone thinking of it as a duty to seek out smart people with whom they disagree. So we're faced with a really serious long-term problem of political polarization, and I do think universities could do a better job of teaching people that it's a duty to seek out smart people with whom you disagree. Now, what will that do for the part of the population that doesn't go to college? I don't know.
Other questions? Here in the front in the black shirt.
Hello, okay. I just wanted for a second to return to Lily's point, who was the question previous. I think that often, like, the problems that I have with arguments that are anti-trigger warnings or anti-free speech limitations is that it often comes from people that are in positions of privilege. And I just wonder if you think that it's possible that, you know, you've been using kind of dismissive language of ridiculous or laughable examples of this happening, and I was just wondering if you think that, as a white man, seeing Trump or a Trump slogan might not pose as much of a threat to you, and perhaps Trump is somebody that could deport someone's family or strip a woman's reproductive rights, and for seeing that on a campus, which, as you were saying, is where somebody lives and learns and studies and eats and spends all of their time, if perhaps coming from a place of privilege, you're not able to be threatened by that as much as somebody else would, and I wonder how much that plays into your arguments against free speech limitations or trigger warnings or safe spaces.
Snapping. Yeah, privilege is definitely an argument I run into a lot on campuses. And good job, by the way. When it comes to privilege, I think absolutely privilege is obviously a real thing. My opinions about Trump, I run a nonpartisan organization. We can talk personally about what my opinions are on Trump. I have very strong opinions about him. But as I said, I run a nonpartisan organization, but you can guess. So when it comes to privilege, I think just like the same way I think microaggressions are a real thing, and microaggressions are worthy of study. When privilege is used as a way to say, I'm now skeptical of what you had to say because I think you're privileged, you'll notice that people very rarely use that for people they agree with. If it's someone that they agree with, they're immediately saying, the privilege flies out the window. You get to keep Karl Marx. You get to keep every thinker that you ever agreed with, even if they were the most privileged person on the entire planet. And so when it's used rhetorically to actually narrow the number of people you have to listen to, I think it can actually be very harmful. It can actually thicken the walls of your echo chamber. I do think privilege is absolutely a real thing, but it can be rhetorically used in a way that isn't productive. I think it is a fact, though, at the same time.
Can I just put a little wrinkle on it? Because I heard the question maybe a little bit differently, which was, not about sort of privilege and whether that, becomes a screen that can allow people to screen out a speaker or a point of view, but rather, whether there's sort of an affirmative obligation to adopt the subjectivity of somebody who may experience speech or a situation very, very differently than you do, whether it's by virtue of their gender, their size, their ethnicity, their life history. For them, those words on the chalkboard, whether they be about Trump or about women, might have a radically different impact. And is it the obligation of those who are not affected in that way to take into account that perspective? That's kind of part of, or at least I think, a question I've asked, and I heard a bit of that there. Angus?
Yeah, no, and I think that's absolutely crucial from a few different perspectives. I use trigger warnings in my classroom. I was one of the first professors in the country to talk publicly about why I do that, and a lot of that has to do with my position as a white man in the classroom and the ways in which that gives me power over students who are students of color, who are women, who are combat veterans, who are the survivors of abuse. My privilege there creates a dynamic in which it can be difficult for students to challenge in me. And so encouraging students to challenge me and encouraging students to feel safe and respected in that classroom is really, really important. I think it's also important when we're talking about, as you said, a duty to listen to people who are not like us. I think one of the things that always comes up for me is that duty is most often framed in terms of a duty of people on the left end of the spectrum, of women, of people of color, of people who are outside of the mainstream in a variety of identity-based contexts, when the reality is that people who are outside the mainstream from the perspective of identity do spend a lot of time listening to people who are represented in the more dominant narratives, because those narratives are dominant, right? And so I think it's very important to say that it's absolutely essential for people who are within the mainstream of opinion to spend time listening to people who are outside that mainstream, which is not something that happens very often at all.
All right, so Angus, you said you appreciate being challenged. So here's a question that came in online for you, which is the person writing would like to hear more from you about your idea that campus disinvitations might, in some circumstances, serve the cause of free speech. Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, I think, let me talk a little bit about a particular genre of disinvitation, and that is commencement speeches. Commencement is, to my mind, a day that should be about the students, right? This, particularly the students who are graduating. It is the culmination of the time that you have spent on campus. It is a very big deal. But on most campuses, students don't determine the commencement speaker. I think that students should get to choose the commencement speaker. And I think that if an administrator or a small undemocratically elected group chooses a commencement speaker who I abhor, that it's legitimate for me to say, you know what, that's not really how I want that day to go. That's not really what I want to have happen, particularly when, as is the case in most of these situations, the person who is getting giving the commencement address is getting a 5-figure or 6-figure paycheck that is coming out of student fees. I think it is legitimate for students to want to have a say in how their fees are spent. And so protests against speakers, commencement speakers in particular, who you don't like, strike me as a legitimate free speech exercise. Also, I would note that a bunch of the disinvitations that are listed in the on the fire site are people who actually withdrew, not people who were disinvited. And I think that withdrawing and being disinvited are two very different things as well.
Yep.
I think we have time, unfortunately, only for one more question. So I'm going to go to in the black and white in the fourth row, and I think the mic is coming.
I wanted to address something that actually came up in the previous discussion as well, because while I agree that privilege can affect the way that different speech affects us, what I noticed that shifted, and this came up in the first speech, was what we expect from institutions in terms of regulation and administration and this idea of litigiousness. Mm-hmm. And it raises the question for me, it's like, yes, I feel unsafe and traumatized as a woman when I hear some of the things that Donald Trump says. But I wonder if it should be my expectation that my government then do something about what he's able to say, or whether that pushes at the limits of government and the action that should be taken should be directed somewhere else. I don't know if you have thoughts on the limits of regulation on college campuses, the limits of the law, and what we ask the law and the bureaucracy of our educational systems to do.
I mean, I know we're running out of time, so I'll just say my point of view very, very simply. And it's the way I explain it when I'm in Europe as well. My thoughts on the First Amendment and my thoughts on good thinking when it comes to how you actually have free speech in a genuine, diverse, pluralistic society are very closely aligned. I think actually one of the best thought out bodies of philosophical thought we have for how do you actually do it in the real world is in First Amendment law. And one of the principles that we have, the thing that puzzles everyone all over the world, that makes people think America is completely anarchical and addicted to the First Amendment, is we have a bedrock principle that you can't ban speech simply because it's offensive. And that's because it's so inherently subjective. If we really were to follow it in a way that everybody's offense was immediately a trump over speech, we'd all be reduced to silence. And we see countries that are actually trying to have these ones that have much more subjectivity embedded into them, and they're really struggling to try to figure out what on earth they're allowed to say, with some, in some cases, ridiculous, in some cases, tragic results.
Very, very quickly, I think that one of the questions that we need to look at is not just what regulations exist, but who's making the regulations. And one of, I think, the defects of the American university is that students are members of the university community, but they are not citizens of the university community. And I think that if students had a much more active role in university governance, these debates would be playing out in a very different way, because a lot of the lashing out that we see is not students lashing out from a place of power, but lashing out from a place of powerlessness. And I think that if students had more of a say in the running of the university, they would be forced to grapple with these issues in a very, very different way. And I think that would be a very healthy outcome.
Okay. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I think it was a terrific discussion. There is more in the Penn report on many of the topics, whether it's the damage of a speaker who withdraws voluntarily or the question of safe spaces, big and small. So I urge you to check it out. And I was pleased that even from both sides of this debate, we had some praise for it. So that's very gratifying to hear. But above all, I really want to thank both Greg and Angus for a very rich discussion. Thank you.